Hello and welcome to today's VMware Webcast. Before we get started, there are a couple of housekeeping items that I would like to go over. First, we want to make this session as interactive as possible and encourage you to ask questions at any time using the question and answer box located to the left of the slides window. You can also use the question and answer box to get technical assistance if you should need it. The tabs located in the question and answer box are where you can find additional information about today's presentation. Today's presentation features streaming audio only, so there is no need to dial into a teleconference. You'll need to make sure that your computer speakers are turned up in order to hear the presenter and today's content. You can also fine-tune the audio by using the volume controls inside the media window. This presentation console allows you to interact and customize the layout to fit your viewing needs. You can collapse and expand any window on the console just like you would on your desktop by dragging the corners in or out. In addition, you can also maximize or close any of the windows on your screen by clicking the corresponding icon in the upper right-hand corner of each of the windows. At any time, you can reset the console to the default layout and access additional presentation functionality using the widgets at the bottom of your screen. Now, I'd like to turn things over to today's presenter to get things started.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the first episode of the VMC on AWS Webcast series. This first episode will focus on disaster recovery and how to adopt resiliency in the cloud as you transition and embark on your digital transformation. My name is Belu de Arbelais, and I am joined today by my colleagues Mike McLaughlin and Andrea Siviera. Let's get started. So let's go over the topics that we're going to cover today. First, we're going to start off with a solution overview, so basically an introduction to the product. Then we're going to move on to what our key use cases are and what our value proposition for each of this is. After that, I'm going to pass it over to Mike, who's going to run us through resiliency in the cloud delivered, and he is going to show us a technical deep dive as well as a product demo. And last but not least, we are going to show you how to streamline your DR implementation by using VMware Professional Services. So there's a lot of stuff to share, so stay tuned. Okay, let's start by the basics, right? What are the basic things that we need to understand in order to be able to talk about disaster recovery and plan for disaster recovery? Now, many of you might already be familiar with these terms, but in the off chance that someone isn't, we're going to refresh them. So DRaaS, Disaster Recovery as a Service. So it's a cloud computing service model that allows you to basically conduct DR orchestration and functionality through a SaaS-based solution. RPO. It's basically how frequently backups are created and stored. RTO, Recovery Time Objective, the amount of time taken to recover from a DR event. Failover, the process of transferring mission-critical data from your primary production site and recovering the system in an off-site location, in this case, the cloud. Failback, the process of transferring mission-critical workloads back to the on-prem location or to the production site from the off-site DR location. And last but not least, something we all know too well, unfortunately, ransomware. It has become one of the most prevailing threats in disaster recovery, and this is something that we're definitely addressing at VMware. So let's dive into one more slide to make sure that we understand the RPO and the RTO. So in case it's not clear, you can see here that the RPO marks the time between the last viable restore point and the time disaster strikes, whereas the RTO, or Recovery Time Objective, covers the time between disaster and the time you recover full functionality of your systems. Now let's talk about the product, right? What is VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery? I'll tell you about it. So basically, VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery offers on-demand disaster recovery delivered as an easy-to-use solution with cloud economics. Basically, VMware Cloud DR allows you to manage efficient cloud storage with SaaS-based management to achieve IT resiliency at scale in the cloud. How do we do this? Through simple testing and orchestration of your failover and failback plans. The cool part about it is that you can benefit from a pay-when-you-need failover capacity model. So this means that you are able to balance your TCOs to your SLAs by choosing different deployment options. This is, of course, critical when it comes to protecting your critical data from threats such as ransomware, power outages, or natural disasters. Now, this is what the product looks like. And I think it's important that we take a look at the UI, because by understanding the UI, we are able to realize how easy to use this product is. So as you can see, we have the topology of our different sites very clearly shown. We have monitoring, and Mike is going to talk more about all the details, but it's very important to understand the key terms and the key components of our UI, because that will also help you realize the value of the solution. So here we dive into what our three key pillars of value are. First, we start with on-demand. This is actually a revolutionary way of approaching DR, because it allows you to have two different deployment options, right? One that basically provisions failover capacity on demand, so you don't have to maintain a secondary DR site in the cloud. And the other one for fastest RTO is with pilot light option, where you basically provision a small amount of failover capacity on VMC on AWS and benefit from disaster recovery with fastest RTO and with the same benefits of no VM format conversions, which might make your operations brittle, and of course, bringing an added benefit when it comes to recovering from ransomware. Our second key pillar of value is the ease of use. And we cannot highlight this enough. The reason why this matters is because the easier your solution is to use, the less training you're going to require for your IT teams. This is important. Having consistent, familiar operations across your systems reduces the risk of human error, right? Having SaaS-based management also facilitates use by actually allowing you to manage your entire ecosystem and have your DR managed by VMware. Continuous DR health checks. This, again, is super important when it comes to recovering from disaster, right? You need to be able to ensure that you are DR ready at all times. Built-in audit reports, something that's usually overlooked, but we are realizing the importance of companies actually providing reports that they are conducting their disaster recovery operations correctly, right? It is our data, it is our responsibility as organizations and as customers. Third pillar, cloud economics. This is a game changer. So as I mentioned before, you have a pay-as-you-need failover capacity. You can benefit from the elasticity and reliability of cloud, right? We have also introduced simplified pricing, and to the benefit of the customer, we have optimized Delta-based failbacks. So what that means is that when you are ready to fail back to your production site, only the deltas and the data get transferred back. So that actually minimizes your egress charges. Okay, let's talk a little bit about what our key use cases are. We have identified 3 top use cases based on our conversations with customer, market research, and experience. So the first one of these is actually replacing existing DR. So you have a colo lease that's expiring. You have an old DR site that is already amortized. You want transition to cloud and want to be resilient in the process, right? So this process of modernizing and rethinking your approach to disaster recovery is something we can help with. Second, optimize DR costs. And this is not about lowering the value of your solution. It's about efficient protection, right? Effective protection is incredibly important. You need to be able to do the job, but can you do the job better? Can you do it matching your TCO to your SLAs so that your information, your data, your workloads have the right level of protection. And then, last but not least, ransomware recovery. It is critical for organizations to be able to rapidly recover from ransomware. This is a threat that has become even more important since the world has become remote. So we cannot stress this enough. If you don't have a ransomware plan, you should, and come talk to us about it, because we have very, very interesting solutions for you that can save your business if you get hit. So let's dive into a couple of key differentiators that we offer for each of our top use cases. So when it comes to replacing an existing DR solution, this is key, right? So you don't want to replace your solution and have to manage and deploy and go through all the different steps that are required to actually be able to use your solution, right? If you have an end-to-end SaaS solution, you do not need a secondary data center. You do not need to manage it because it's VMware managed. On the other hand, the DR health checks allow you to basically ensure that your environment is DR ready at all times. And, you know, this is where practice helps, right? So having an easy way of testing your failover or your disaster recovery operations as a whole increases the chances of you being able to perform those tests more frequently, non-disruptively, and at the same time be ready to conduct your operations if disaster strikes. When it comes to optimizing DR costs, we mentioned the difference between the two deployment options with pilot light option and the fully on demand. So we are giving customers here freedom of choice to adjust the solution to their needs, right? When it comes to the third pillar, ransomware, there are two very important things that VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery does for our customers. First of all, we have multiple immutable copies that live in the cloud. These can be hours to months old, right? This is very important because these copies cannot be altered by malware, right? So once disaster strikes, if it does, what you can do is easily identify a recovery point to recover from, right? And we help with this as well because we are able to conduct rapid recovery point experiments with the added value of no data rehydration. So before I turn it over to Mike, I'm going to briefly cover two sub-use cases that we've identified. And these are very much tied with current trends that we are seeing both in the workplace as well as in the importance of data management and the data that organizations have from people worldwide, right? The first one is one I sort of mentioned early on, Audit Ready Dr, right? So organizations who have internal or external regulations that require audits. A specific benefit that we bring here is that we provide automated reports for people to be able to provide this as proof that their DR plans are being executed and rehearsed correctly. And the second sub-use case that we've identified is RoboDR, or Remote Branch Office DR. With VMware Cloud DR, you are able to protect up to 20 remote sites and manage everything from a centralized DR management console. So there's a lot to unpack, so I'm going to pass it over to Mike. So Mike, take it away.
Hey, thanks, Baloo. Yeah, so I'm Mike McLaughlin. I'm a senior technical marketing architect with VMware, focusing on VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. And in this next section, we're going to deep dive into the product a little bit. We're going to look at some of the architecture, some of the components and processes, and then I'll end with a short little demonstration of an example of using VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. So with that, let's jump right into the architecture. So a couple of things that Baloo said earlier we're going to touch on here. So thousands of customers have VMware running in their data centers now, and the cloud, VMC on AWS, is a great place to use as a disaster recovery solution. So imagine I've got a production site that's running virtual machines. It's got data stores, vSAN, you name it. It's running vSphere. It's a VMware environment. And I'd like to have a disaster recovery solution without necessarily standing up a secondary site every time I need it. Well, VMware has a capability here with VMware Cloud on AWS and VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery for a complete VMware managed solution that's made up of a couple of parts. So let's take a look. The first thing here, the cloud-based services, these are the essential components or parts of VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. There's a SaaS orchestrator, a UI management plane. We'll see that in a little bit, that drives the whole thing. It's actually running in the cloud, so it's not dependent on your on-prem locations or any other deployments that you might have to manage yourself. It's managed for you as a service. In the cloud, we also have our scale-out cloud file system, which is optimized on cloud-based storage for the protected virtual machines and applications that you want to cover in your production site. Now, there's a little piece in here called the Drast Connector, which is the third part of this solution. That's a very easy to install OVA appliance into your production site to basically give VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery access to the virtual machines and the environment and the storage to protect it to the scale-out cloud file system. Now, that in and of itself might be of value, but we're just basically protecting your production site to the cloud. Using this for disaster recovery gets even easier or kind of smoother here. From the VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery platform, I can deploy an SDDC in the cloud, a vCenter, a complete environment with vSANs underneath of it. All of the components get automatically deployed from the VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery platform. And what you'll see here, that live mount line that just got connected between the two is part of the technology here. Is that scale-out cloud file system, which has those protected copies of your virtual machines, is now mounted to your SDDC in the cloud so that I can pull virtual machines into recovery by merely bringing them into inventory and powering them on. All right, there's no lengthy restores, there's no conversions, there's very little mechanics. That literally is mount, the NFS mount is already there. We're going to bring those into inventory and power them on. So when there is a disaster, you get near instant power onto those virtual machines, and they're now running in the cloud. So you've protected them on-prem with the Drast Connector connecting to our cloud-based services. We've taken those cloud-based services, spun up your SDDC, and brought the virtual machines into inventory, ready to run. Now, that sounds pretty simple. In the VMware environment, we've got VMware on the left side, we've got VMware on the right side, we've got data stores in the middle as well. So bringing the workload back is a fairly simple process as well. We can use change block tracking to minimize the amount of storage and data that has to come out of the cloud, because eventually you're going to want to return back to service in your production site. This is disaster recovery. This isn't a migration. We want to have a place where we can go operate our business while we solve the problem that happened on the left. All right, and that's the basic architecture of the components of VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. Now let's kind of peel back the layer a little bit. So on the right-hand side, these are the things Baloo was talking about, simpler management, cost efficiencies, increased confidence. We're talking about run books and cloud economics and a number of things. Well, to get those results, you go to the left-hand side. I just mentioned the SaaS orchestrator, the scale-out cloud file system, and the Drast Connector. Those parts have to be installed, all right? And then as a DR administrator or a DR IT professional, you'll then build those things in the middle of this diagram, the protected sites, the protection groups, and the DR plans. We're going to talk about each of those in just a little bit more detail, but these are fairly common concepts in disaster recovery, in the disaster recovery world. Protected sites are obviously the things that I'm going to fail over. Protection groups are going to be my policies that determine when and how things get protected, and the DR plans are the step-by-step run books that I want to construct, and I'd like to have automated as much as possible with the tools that I'm using. All right, so we're going to kind of dive into that a little bit more. Let's talk about these protection group policies. This is actually the foundation for disaster recovery to the cloud. And what we need to do is look at our on-prem production site where we've installed that Drast connector. We now have visibility into that environment, but there's virtual machines sort of laying around, and the organization of those virtual machines is something that you understand as a user of the technology. Well, we're going to want to basically organize those. Now, for the sake of this discussion, I've called it App 1, App 2, App 3. All right, this could be webmail, databases, you name it. But there's a logical organization, and we're going to use the policies to organize our virtual machines into these logical groupings, because that's how we're going to meet the SLAs of the organization. All right, once we've grouped them, we can then schedule their protection. The Drast Connector is in charge of snapshotting and determining the change blocks on those virtual machines and transporting that to the cloud. But these schedules will run automatically through the VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery product. And I can have multiple schedules running through the environment. So I might have a virtual machine that's protected every 4 hours because I want a lower RPO, or maybe it's protected every day or every week because I want to have at least a checkpoint that I can roll back to. For example, if I get hit with ransomware or some other failure that I'm just now recognizing. So the multiple schedules and the multiple retention levels make this a very robust protection capability, policy-driven. So basically any vCenter that we connect to in your production site has the Drast connector installed, talks to the VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery orchestrator, and all of this gets set up. We're going to look at an example of this a little bit later in more detail, but the protection groups give me those groupings of things that I want to recover. Now, once I have the protection groups, I now have the basis for building a DR plan. The DR plans are built by selecting a protection group, one or more, and then defining the other steps around what to do with those virtual machines that I've protected in the cloud. All right, so the point here is that the protection groups give me the basis. The DR plans are then what to do with them, and I can organize those in different ways. So my virtual machines can be in different protection groups. They can be in different DR plans. And you have the flexibility here to build something that may just fail over a single application or an entire site, depending on how you've organized the protection policies in your implementation. Now that we have our protection groups defined, all right, and we have a basis for what's going to fail over, the DR plan sets forth all the instructions and the organization of that. And there's about 12 steps here, but I'm going to organize this so it's a little easier to understand. The first part of the DR plan sets the scope. These are the sites that are going to be involved in this particular plan, the production site and the DR site. All right. And the groups, the protection groups that are part of the inventory that this plan will address. So all of the virtual machines that we just grouped together in our protection groups are now forming the basis for what fails over in a DR plan. Once we have the scope of the DR plan, we then need to map them together. So our production site has virtual machines running in some particular configuration, and our DR site has resources and networks and locations. And what we need to do is map those together so that when that virtual machine is brought out of the live mount data store, it has a place to go. It knows where to run, where to live, what to connect to, and how to come online in the new location in the DR site. So these mappings are critical. We'll talk a little bit more about setting those up in just a moment. But once I have the mappings, all right, I have essentially a set of connections. Now, what I'd like to make sure is that my disaster recovery solution keeps an eye on those, so that if I have operational drift, something changes in my production or my DR site, I'd like to know about that change if it affects one of the plans that I set up. So a plan that I build on Monday will still run on Tuesday, even though I may have made changes. I'd like to get alerts to that. And we'll see that here in just a moment. Another part of the plan, which we won't get into today, it's actually a fairly deeper subject, but there are customization capabilities in here for mapping IP addresses from site to site. This is going to be very specific to your implementation, as well as script virtual machine extensions. So the disaster recovery orchestrator has a hook that it can reach out into the DR environment and essentially run scripts in that environment to help extend the capabilities of the orchestration. Like I said, those are sort of deeper subjects for another topic, but they are things that can be hooked into each DR plan to make them very robust or relatively simple if needed. The recovery steps, and we'll talk about this in just a moment, is essentially the order of events and the sequence of what happens in this plan. And then the last thing I mentioned, the alerts. Each plan has a number of alert capabilities. So if something happens in the compliance checking, the site configuration, if something's not reachable, if a protection group is not working properly, or anything in the orchestration that we can track, the compliance checks will be running that. You can also have alerts if somebody's actually executing the plan, or maybe I built in a user input and it's waiting for my administrator to type something in. There's a number of things in the plans that can be alerted. It just makes the product run smoother and gives you a higher degree of confidence that when something is changing or moving in your DR solution, your DR administrators will be able to track that. All right, let's look at the recovery steps, the one I selected here. And the recovery steps are basically going to look at the inventory that you specified in the scope, the protection groups. So every virtual machine that's in one of those protection groups has to be accounted for in a recovery step. Now that could be a complete protection group. All of the virtual machines in that protection group, please bring those online and bring them up and get them running. I really don't care what order they come on in. That whole protection group needs to be brought online. I can also pick individual virtual machines out of my inventory. So if I know that a particular application VM needs to come online before another one, this is where I can set not only the order, but the granularity and the precedence of the steps. And then finally, I have some user actions I can put in here. I can put in delayed waits, script calls, user input requests, a number of things to make the plan more robust and more accurate to the environment that I'm building it for. All right. So we have a very simple to set up, yet robust capability for building the DR plans using the protection groups. All right. What we're going to look at now is how you might go about building a VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery solution. All right. So we start with our vCenter in our production site, the customer site, and we're going to get our scale out cloud file system when we acquire VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. We'll be able to log into the cloud-based orchestrator and download the Drast Connector and get that whole software set up. This usually takes a couple of hours or a day, depending on your environment and your networking and other, sort of installation capabilities. But once I have that, I now have the mechanism to define my protection groups and begin moving data to the cloud. Those groups of virtual machines that are going to be recovered together can now be making their way to the scale-out cloud file system in VMC on AWS. Now, to do the mappings, the left and right-hand side, the production DR side, I'm going to need an SDDC. So I can deploy one of those just in time. I could have one in a pilot mode, or I could have a fully deployed SDDC that I'm working with in a hybrid cloud mode. But I'm going to need both of those to make the mappings. And once I have the mappings, I can then fill out the plans. So it's a fairly straightforward process of installing the software, protecting the environment, mapping them together, and then building the DR plans so that you can run through and execute them and test them and do all of the other things that you want in your solution. Okay. Now, I'm going to go into a product demonstration in just a little bit, but I want to kind of step back for a minute and look at what you would do with VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. All right. And there's a number of things we could touch on in if we had, an extra 20 or 30 minutes to touch on each of these as an example for a demonstration. But from an operations perspective, the thing that you're going to be most interested in is testing the plans, using the plans to fail over, using the plans to fail back after the disaster, and then in between, making sure that all your reports and health checks are good, that you have confidence that things haven't changed, that the environment's not broken, that you have that confidence that when the time comes to actually call on it for disaster, it's there. All right. Those are what I call operational aspects. From an administration perspective, all right, and this is when we get to the latter half of the session today, you'll see how we can help you with this as well, is building out your protected sites, organizing your virtual machines and building your protection groups and setting your policies. This is the kind of the homework that you get to do on a day-to-day basis as your environments operate. Building those DR plans and testing them, and then just managing the SDDC, the cloud-based environment, because we don't always have to have that there. This is one of the cost benefits, is the DR in the cloud can be a just-in-time or on-demand scenario, or it could be a small pilot light that then expands to the size that we need when disaster strikes. It's really up to you, SLAs and costs and a number of things, but those are more sort of ongoing administration tasks that are part of owning and managing and operating VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. Okay. Now, for what we're going to see today is in the demo is as an example of a test of a DR plan. I want to show you how simple it is to actually test and report on DR in your environment. And this is the setup of what you're going to see. So there's going to basically be an on-prem protected site that we'll have that has some virtual machines up and running and loaded in it. And I've already deployed my SDDC, all right? But I have an empty cloud-based data center that I want to use for DR, and I'm going to use VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery to basically move that workload into the cloud, all right? So when we get into the demonstration here, we're going to basically kind of go through something that looks very similar to that, but in a little bit more real time. So let's go ahead and click into this little recorded video that I have here. So here we are. We're starting off in the dashboard. This is the cloud-based SaaS orchestrator, and you can see the organization of my environment. All right, I've got a couple of protected sites. I've got those bubbles on the right. Here is the situation. On the left is my running on-prem vCenter, and I can tell because of the green and yellow vCenter icon. On the right is an empty SDDC that we're going to fail over into. So I've already got my SDDC deployed, and what I'll do now is go back to the orchestrator that's running independently of both of those sites in the cloud, and I'm going to go to my DR plans view. All right, I'm going to pick a sample application plan that I've already got defined, and you can see there's green check marks. This all looks really good. I've got my compliance check from 14 minutes ago that basically looked at both the left and the right side and the plan, said everything looks good. Let's go ahead and test the plan. Now, these are the protection group recovery points that I have. I have 3 different protection groups in this inventory. I'm going to use the latest snapshot, although I dig back in time for that if I wanted to do like ransomware. I've chosen to leave the virtual machines on the live mount NFS during the testing because, as you saw, it actually expedites things quite a bit. All right, I'm going to go ahead and say test the plan, and it'll begin orchestrating through my DR plan. Now, as this runs in the orchestrator, we can see the steps here. I've got basically 4 virtual machines and then a user input step. I'm going to open a window on the SDDC. And you can see that there's already the database virtual machine present. And as we go through the steps on the left in the plan, those virtual machines are being brought into inventory, configured as necessary, and then basically powered on per DR plan control. So I've got these virtual machines running into a clean SDDC that was already provisioned in a test mode here. Now, when I get to the end and I get to this user input, all right, before I check that everything's okay, I might go to my cloud-based environment, and this is where you have some time to kind of look at each of the virtual machines, make sure everything's like what you expected, that this plan ran as expected, and if it did, we're in this test mode, I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, okay, now that's a user prompt I put into the plan, partly for the demonstration and partly for just going through the steps. Now, the plan has executed its test. I'm going to go ahead and do a cleanup. I'm going to type in cleanup test, and you can probably guess what's going to happen. Those virtual machines that were present in the SDDC, and we'll open that window here in just a moment, are actually going to be powered off, removed, deleted, and we're going to get back to a empty SDDC in this right-hand window. So the testing process basically spun up the workload and tore it down for me. And I'm going to acknowledge the execution here, and then I'm going to go pull up the report of that test plan that I just ran. These are kept in VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. We can create PDF reports for download and sharing, documentation purposes. Let's take a quick look into one of these. And this is a sample application that we just failed over. We'll go down here and we can see in the plan summary, it actually took about 3 minutes, 11 seconds in real time to go through all the steps. The mappings that were in here, we didn't get into the details on that, but the mappings of the plan and each of the steps, or step by step, how much time it took, is laid out in there. So we come back to the dashboard here. We can go back to looking at the plan again. And since we know that it is compliant, we see the green check mark there right above. Now it's 20 minutes ago now. And we've just run through a test of the plan to basically orchestrate all the steps from our left side to the right side, from our production to our DR site. All right. And we took a look at the run book. We did a review with our team on that. We're probably at a really good place in time right now to actually fail over. The simplicity and the confidence that you have now to use that failover button to actually move that workload over to the cloud. And anytime something changes, all right, you want to add something to your production site or add something to the DR site, you can come back and go through this same set of operations. Come in, make sure it's compliant, the green check mark, run a test against it, look at the report, make sure everything works through, and then put it away. Now, remember that SDDC that we had was empty when it started, and it's empty again now. So we can decommission that if we wanted to. This is where the cloud costs and a number of things are very important to understand, is that SDDC is running in a test mode right now. At the end of the testing, I could decommission it and know that the next time I want to run a test, I'll spin up an SDDC just in time, run through the testing, put it away. And that's the way you can manage costs. And we're going to help manage the complexity. All right. Now, I kind of talk with my colleagues about sort of being DR ready in 5 easy steps. And I'll be honest, it is simple to work through this. And I'm going to let Andrea pick up in a little bit because there's a little bit of homework involved here. All right. And if you look at these 5 steps of deploying and using and being successful with a DR solution, with VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, all right, the first thing you got to do is sort of plan out what you're going to do. All right. Now, you can iterate over this. So this could be a small plan, a bigger plan, but you're going to need to understand those virtual machine mappings that we saw back when we were doing protection groups. I had an inventory of virtual machines. I need to organize those so that I can build the policies to protect them. All right. And this is where we're going to help, basically the SLAs that you're looking for. Do I need to snapshot these every 4 hours, every night, every week? What do I need to do to protect my environment? And organize the environment so that it's easier to protect. All right. Remember, we talked about the membership being either with names or folders or tags. There's a number of ways of organizing your virtual machine inventory so that it's easy to work through. Second step here, and we're going to get into these in a little bit more detail, is basically defining, building out the sites, the policies. We had a lot of that done before we did the demo today. Configuring your environment. I've already had my SDDC deployed. My cloud site was deployed. I already had my mappings in place. I showed you those in the run book. And I already had the DR plan defined. All right. So we kind of walked through something that was already canned. It was sort of at the end of the exercise. Today we went through a test, the 4th step here. We actually tested our failover. We looked at how long it took, what the steps looked like. We didn't have to make any adjustments, but then we were able to, after the test, is review the run book, make sure the sites are operating the way we want, and report an audit, or in some sense, repeat this whole process over again. Go back and get another part of our workload and run it through the plan, define, configure, test, operate. So there's a nice cycle here that the platform provides some simplicity into. Now, there's a few things in here that you're saying, well, Mike, that's maybe a little bit more complicated than just clicking some buttons like we saw in the demo. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Andrea so that you can get a feel for how VMware can help with that part of the journey now.
All right. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Belu, for the introduction. My name is Andrea Siviero. I'm Principal Architect at VMware, and let's see how VMware Professional Services can help you to drive this experience, right? So as you've seen from Mike and Belu, the technology itself is pretty easy, but the difference is in the details. And VMware Professional Services has an experience of hundreds of customers already deployed the solution, and we have been able to lead the customer through a proven multi-stage approach. We are able to help the customer to establish the process that help to build the confidence in IT and business teams. And last but not least is helping the customer to go through the entire planning of the disaster recovery, testing the process, and understand how to fix quickly the configuration drift and having a high success rate in the disaster recovery testing. Let's start with the first set of questions, right? That's where we start. So failing to plan is planning to fail. And that's very true. And it's very important for us and the customer to understand, say, a series of questions, like, for example, what is the RTO? And RTO sometimes is not just one parameter that is across everything, and sometimes is defined at the application level or at the facility level. Also, customer, we want to know, for example, what are the mission critical workloads and what are the less critical workloads. So understanding, for example, how the customer and what type of disaster the customer is planning to protect from, right? And that will change the entire operation. And also, when was the last time the customer has tested the disaster recovery? This is another very simple question, because it will help us to understand better how the customer is positioned as a current state and defining the end state. So let's see the methodology here that we have in place. So first of all, we start with discovery and developing a strategy with the customer together about the topic that we spoke before, like the question that we want to ask. So understanding exactly what is the strategy that customer want to achieve and what is the final goal of the customer. And then we start to discovery, analyze, and starting to protect the environment, right? That's another important step. On top of that, creating a disaster recovery plan is critical, because you allow the customer to understand what are all the steps and the sequencing to be efficient during a disaster recovery. And executing a disaster recovery testing is critical, right? And one probably of the most benefit of having a disaster recovery as a service solution, because you will be able to test the disaster recovery more frequently than ever and validating any configuration drift that you have in the past and make more proficient the execution of disaster recovery. As a last step, you want to operate the environment, and we want to help you on operating that, because of course, after you have set up everything, you want to keep up, in a good, healthier environment and make sure that it will be always react immediately when it's needed. So let's see every single step in a little bit more detail. So first of all, a disaster recovery strategy needs to be built, right? And as you see, the technology is pretty straightforward and simple. Probably in the first week, you will be already able to set it up and validate that everything is in place. But then the actual work that needs to be done, it can be a little bit complicated at the beginning, because the customer needs to understand, for example, the dependency between applications, how to create a plan that's take in consideration all the dependency between applications, the networking configuration. And all of those aspects may be a little bit difficult to understand at the first time. So what we are going to cover with the customer is to help them to speed up that process. And then if the customer wants to continue themselves, we will be able to do a teach process. And if the customer instead want to VMware to cover the entire end-to-end, we will be more than happy to do that as well. So this slide is the most interesting one, because for disaster recovery, you need to set up a dream team, right? That's the key aspect for a disaster recovery. When a disaster happens, you don't have time to send emails. You probably don't even have the system to send email during the disaster, right? So you want to have everything already in place You have to have a dream team that is composed by champions that come in from different areas in your organization. So think about a champion in the compute storage networking area from the infrastructure perspective, but also from the security and compliance. Especially also on the application owners, you want to have a champion that will be able to lead the entire application teams to reconverge quickly during the disaster. And of course, the entire support and operation team need to be ready to react after a disaster. As Mike and Belu mentioned before, there are two main approaches, and we are going to help you based on your requirements. So based on the RTO and the TCO that you want to achieve, of course, there are two paths. So the first one is the on-demand. Is very interesting approach, because in this case, you don't have to have any SDDC ready on the VMC. You can just start and back up your data, and they will be backed up in a file server in the cloud. And this solution will allow you to power on VMs only when a disaster recovery happens and starting up the entire VMC just in time. That, of course, is at the cost of timing, right? So creating a new SDDC in VMC AWS, it takes about 90 minutes, can go up to 2 hours, depending on the time of the time zone or in the area that strike the disaster recovery strike. But it may take time, so it may affect the RTO, right? So it's definitely optimized for total cost of ownership, but it may affect the RTO. So on the other side, the pilot light instead is optimized for RTO. So it's basically lower at maximum the RTO. So it allows you to have an SDDC already there, ready to accept the VMs, to start and booting them up. So you will be able to start immediately to recover your VMs. And then it can be based on a minimum of 3 hosts and grow progressively during the disaster, right? So there's no need to have the entire SDDC sized for the final goal from the beginning. You can start with a minimum of 3 hosts and grow them up during the disaster. That's the perfect combination, because it will allow you to reduce as much as possible the recovery time objective. Another important consideration, and where PSO professional services will help you, is defining the connectivity between your on-prem and the cloud. Of course, when a disaster strikes, your network probably will not be there, right? But what is important in the network connectivity is when you go to do the testing. So there are multiple scenarios that customer may test. So you don't want to test the entire disaster recovery every time. You may want to separate testing per application, per business unit. And that's where the design of the network can be helpful, because you can design, for example, to recover some components of your entire disaster recovery, validating that this part has been successfully executed, and then switch to the next one. To do that, of course, you have to plan how to do that part of networking. There are different ways. You can disaster recovery testing only a specific area in a bubble, or creating layer 2 extension, or creating an extended network that is communicating between on-prem and the testing area. So all of those combinations will be covered, and we are going to help you how to design a proper networking solution. Another important aspect that Mike covered as well is the concept of protection group. So a protection group is a group of VMs that need to stay together, right? Especially from the dependency and the recovery perspective. Think about all the business critical application, and every single business critical application need to have a dependency with other components. So how do you do that? Normally, you can just simply interview the application team, understanding that maybe you already have those information. But if you don't have those information, professional services will help you to discover those from a solution that we have that is called VRLIze Network Insight. VRLIze Network Insight allow you to discover the traffic between VMs, and we will be able to tag every single workload and call them with the proper application ownership. So we can define, for example, the dependency between applications. And with that, we can define a strategy on what will be the dependency, what will be the sequencing between applications during the disaster, but also to define what is the minimal protection group that you want to create and how to group VMs together. So that's where from VRNI we can export the configuration, creating a dynamic protection group in in VCDR. And that will allow us to be more granular in defining, for example, a DR plan per specific application, and then having a DR plan for the entire site. So this is a very important step, and we are going to help you on doing those activities. And okay, as I mentioned before, testing for disaster recovery is critical, right? And that's where the benefit of a solution like VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery is going to help you, because traditional disaster recovery will always have a gap between when you have done the test and when the disaster recovery happened. And guess what? Application change every day. Configuration in the networking, the system change every day. We have been also in the customer that never tested their own disaster recovery, right? They have it only on the paper. So guess what? When a disaster kick in, something goes wrong, right? And that's what we want to avoid. We want to frequently testing the disaster recovery, identifying the configuration drifting, and make sure that those configuration will be fixed. So every time you do the disaster recovery testing, there will be also an automated way to catch those drifting and make sure the testing will be continuously successfully. So you can move from 6 months, 1 year testing into monthly testing for disaster recovery. And also, as you have seen from the protection group concept, you can also validate disaster recovery testing by business group. You don't have to validate the disaster recovery as a whole company every time. Another important aspect is manage and operate, right? As we mentioned, when the configuration is done and everything is running as you want, of course, you want to make sure that everyone understands their own role and how the cloud environment will be operated. Now you have a new cloud environment, a new endpoint, a disaster recovery. They need to be managed and operate, right? You don't have to forget about it, because when it's going to be needed, you want to be efficient and ready to go. So with VMware and professional services, we can work you through a RACI matrix, understanding who are the roles and who can do what, and especially go back to the concept of the dream team, right? Make sure that the dream team is absolutely up to speed with all the processes, and make sure that when a disaster recovery strike, everyone know what they have to do. So with that, I'm going to close the slide saying that, yeah, VMware has more than 20 years of experience of consultant. We are present in all the 20 global Fortune industry sectors. We have a very high score on NPS with our customer, and we deliver every day those kind of complex solutions to our customer successfully, right? So if you need help, don't hesitate to contact us. So I'm going to leave you with this slide with the additional resources. I think we can share also the link after the presentation. And thank you again. And now we are ready to take questions, I think, below in the box.
Okay. A couple of minutes here. I'm going to look through the questions. It looks like most of them got answered within the Q&A. But for those of you that are not on the Q&A, I may read out one or two of the interesting ones here in just a moment. Okay, there's a couple of questions about configuration and costing, and my first recommendation is with a SaaS delivered solution, always check the current offering from the website. So and I put a link in the Q&A session on that, but it's on VMware.com. But the basic is to use VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. You will need a VMC account or credits, because to deploy an SDDC, there's going to be a need for that and costs for that. The general sizing and cost of the VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery solution is based on the storage footprint that we need for that live mount NFS, the scale out cloud file system, and the number of virtual machines that get failed over during a DR event. So the organization of those virtual machines into protection groups and whatnot, that's part of what we covered in the presentation, but that's part of how it is acquired and sized and where the costs come in. Now, the SDDC is needed for configuring, for testing, and for actual failover. So it's not a 24/7 kind of requirement. And that's one of the ways that you can use this to help mitigate overall DR costs. VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery also can coexist with existing VMware DR solutions like SRM and vSphere replication. We call that VMware Site Recovery, or VSR. That can coexist with the cloud SDDCs along with VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery if they're put together the right way, basically how they're constructed. And that's actually an excellent opportunity to possibly have a small pilot light for certain workloads and VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery on-demand scalability for more general purpose DR. I'm summarizing some of the questions that I've seen in the chat here about just how the product is set up. Okay. Feel free to keep typing in the Q&A window. We'll get to those. We've got another couple of minutes here. I'm going to drop a couple of links in the Q&A window, or even in the chat window here in just a moment. But there are a couple of VMware resources that I would suggest folks sort of put a shortcut to in addition to just the website. So there is the VMware Compatibility Matrix, or Compatibility Guide, the online version will actually tell you which versions of the on-prem environment are supported, what versions of the cloud are connected up. There's also a entries in what's called the configuration maximums tool. So if you're looking at how big of a deployment you could have, I mean, the minimum is outlined in the pricing link, and it's right now it's 5 gigabytes, and there is no minimum number of VMs. But if you wanted to see how big this could go, configuration maximums is also a great resource on the VMware site. And for connecting your on-prem environment to your cloud environment, there were some questions about networking and security and establishing network costs. There is nothing built into VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery that is accounting for network, but the network has to be there. Your wide area network needs to be there, and there is also a resource for the ports and protocols needed to connect an on-prem environment and a cloud environment. And I'll drop those into the chat window for everybody. Excellent resources to have on hand if you're going to look at this is the sort of sizing, designing, or some preliminary thoughts on this solution. Okay, question here about picking the implementation region. So when you're setting up VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery, again, you'll need an AWS account to establish some linking, but there are no real charges that go in there. You'll need to have your VMC capability through credits or an account, and that will need to be in the region where you want to deploy that. So what you'll need to do is look at the regions covered by VMware Cloud on AWS and the regions that are covered by VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery. And they're very close to being the same set. VMC on AWS is basically one step behind all of the AWS regions, and VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery is one small step behind VMC on AWS. So make sure that the regions are covered, and the current information on the website is the best place to see that, because this is literally changing every month or every other month on new feature functionality and capability and coverage. So the answer is yes, you can pick the implementation region for where your SDDC is going to go for failover, and that same region will be where your VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery site will be deployed. So that scale-out cloud file system of all of your cloud-based recovery points will be in the same region as the SDDC as you've contracted for the product, and that will give you that cross-region support. In addition, one question here is using Direct Connect as a means of connecting your on-prem to your cloud environment. That is currently not officially supported. We're in the process of testing that a number of different ways, and part of that is just the connectivity between AWS VMC and vCDR. So if you have questions about that, feel free to reach back to your local team about specifics in the deployment capabilities of each region. But Direct Connect is intended to be a capability that will support for that traffic. Now, there's two things to keep in mind. There is network traffic for the disaster recovery payload, and then there's network traffic
for the application itself. And I think this is a great opportunity to engage with our professional services team, because I'll call that above the line networking, where your applications and your customers and your data centers, whether they're on-prem or in the cloud, need to talk to each other to make the applications work. Direct Connect is supported there. All right. At the underlying level of how VMware Cloud Disaster Recovery gets the change blocks for all of your on-prem protection recovery points to the cloud, that's currently just over a secure link on the public internet. And Direct Connect will be something we are looking at there. So I know that's a long answer, but yes, you can pick the region you want to go to as long as it's supported by all the products. And connecting to that region for either business or DR infrastructure are kind of two different questions to bring back to the table. Thanks. I think with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up today's session. I want to thank you all for attending. If you did not get your question answered here, find a way to get back to us. I'm sure there's a way to make this recording or the details of this, but I think we got all the questions in the Q&A taken care of here. Again, I want to thank you for your time, and hopefully this was informative and interesting. And I want to thank my colleagues, Balu and Andrea, for joining us today. And with that, we're going to wind down this session.